Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 4 of This Week in Elections. This week, the biggest story is Virginia, where voters approved the redistricting referendum. But almost immediately, the court stepped in and blocked the new map, at least for now. So, we're going to break down what happened, why the yes side won, why it was still pretty close in the end, and why this could matter a lot for control of the House if the map actually survives. We'll also talk about two English Council by-elections where Reform UK had a pretty great night on paper, but the numbers underneath were a little bit messier. They gained a seat from Labour in Salford and held on to a seat in Cornwall. But in both cases, they won with pretty soft vote shares, and the Greens had another pretty strong showing. Then we'll briefly check back in on Peru because, somehow this election has only gotten more chaotic. The vote count still isn't fully resolved, and the former election chief's home was raided. And they're still waiting to find out who's going to face Keiko Fujimori in the runoff. After that, we'll briefly go back to Denmark, where coalition talks are still deadlocked after a month post-election. Prime Minister Frederiksen is in a bit of an awkward spot because she called this election in the first place. And after the recaps, we'll look forward to next week, where we have Antigua and Barbuda. They have their general election on the 30th of April. And then we have the Tenbury by-election in England, as well as the Texas Senate District 4 special election on May 2nd. All right, let's get into it. All right, so first up is Virginia, because this was definitely the biggest U.S. election story of last week. Virginia voters approved the redistricting referendum 51.5% to 48.5%, with just over 3 million votes cast. The basic idea was to temporarily suspend the state's current redistricting process, which is the bipartisan commission that Virginia voters approved back in 2020, and to allow the General Assembly instead to redraw Virginia's congressional map for the rest of the decade. And if that Democratic map goes into effect, it could turn Virginia's House delegation from 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans into 10 Democrats and 1 Republican. So, this wasn't just some boring statewide referendum that is usually on your ballot. This was important for control nationally of the House, which is why it garnered so much attention and money. And 3 million votes on a referendum is no joke, even in a state like Virginia. And if we look a little bit closer at the county map, the geographic story is pretty clean. Fairfax went yes by 39 points, Loudoun by 21, Prince William by 26, Henrico by 28. That whole Nova, suburban Richmond corridor really carried it. Virginia Beach went no by less than a point, so pretty much a toss-up in a large, politically mixed area. You have the Sea of Orange no on the map, but that's your small rural towns, and the yes side won where the actual population of the state lives. But I must say this was not a landslide. I predicted coming in, I was saying 5 to 10, probably around that 8 points. Instead, it was 3 points, so definitely a lot closer than I, as well as some others, expected. And, the White House was quick to point out that Republicans overperformed 2024 and 2025 here, but, it's not, great because the Democrats still got the result they wanted. Whether it was by 10 points or whether it was by 1 vote, it doesn't really make a difference. It's just the margin was a tiny bit closer than some Democrats might have hoped, but in the end, they still got what they wanted, regardless of the margin. And like I said before, this wasn't just like a referendum that no one really knew about or paid much attention to. The two sides spent over $85 million, which shattered the record for Virginia's most expensive ballot question in history. The pro-redistricting side raised $64 million to the opposition no side that raised $22 million. And that kind of resource advantage usually does matter. You have the onslaught of ads and mailers, and people knocking on doors. And the Democrats, it seemed that really they needed that what was that 3-to-1 margin in spending. It really came in clutch there because this was a lot closer than I think even a lot of them predicted. And there were actually some reports that some Republican leadership in DC were a little bit, I guess, angered, but that they didn't spend more or get more attention. If they would have maybe doubled their money to around, that 45, 50 million mark, who knows? That could be enough to swing the results in a couple points, more to the no side. So I think there's a little bit of regret there from the Republican side that they might have not invested enough money into this race, and could have squeaked out a no victory if they would have put some more effort into it. Now, as for the arguments in this referendum, the Democrats' argument was pretty straightforward. Republicans were already doing redistricting in other states. Texas redrew its congressional map mid-decade at Trump's urging. You have North Carolina, you have Ohio, you have Missouri, you have potentially Florida. Republicans believe they can net, as many as 9+ seats from redistricting this mid-cycle. And, the Virginia Democrats said, we're not just going to sit back and absorb that, by playing by the older rule book. It was a fight fire with fire campaign, and enough voters believed in that messaging, not overwhelmingly, but enough voters to pass it. And then a day after the vote or the election happened, there was already legal drama. The Tazewell County Circuit Court judge, Jack Hurley, blocked certification of the results, ruling that the referendum was void from the beginning and that the state lawmakers didn't follow their own rules in passing it, and that the ballot language was flagrantly misleading. And then Attorney General Jay Jones said the state would appeal immediately, and there is a pretty liberal bias on the Virginia Supreme Court regardless, so I really don't see this as anything other than a temporary blip in trying to stop this effort, because it will go through. It just really seems as a country we're in a interesting spot on redistricting, where I would say the vast majority of this country wants to ban partisan gerrymandering. But Democrats are not going to just sit down while Republicans in Texas and elsewhere are playing by these rules, these, partisan gerrymandering rules. They will, like I said before, they're going to fight fire with fire. And, you know, Democrats don't want to partisan gerrymander, but they will if it's, I don't want to say if it's the other side who started it, but you can't unilaterally disarm. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So if the Republicans are going to gerrymander, the Democrats are going to gerrymander, and all this leads to is more partisanship. It leads to Republicans in Virginia having less representation. It leads to Democrats in Texas having less representation, Republicans in California having less representation, Democrats in Missouri having less. It just, more people are going to be misrepresented by their congressmen. Nationally, there'll still be the same amount of seats. So all you're doing is having more different politicians representing people they're less aligned with. So it really is unfortunate that we're heading down this road in this country. But until there's some sort of national ban on partisan gerrymandering, it seems this is not going to be going away anytime soon. So while there could be a shock and perhaps the Virginia Supreme Court could rule against this, I find it very highly unlikely that is the case. And then now we will have 4 more Democratic seats in the Virginia House delegation, which will play a big factor into who controls Congress coming this November. All right, now let's head over the pond to England, because there were 2 council by-elections this week, and Reform had a better night than last week, that is. They gained 1 seat and they held on to another. And like I said, on paper, it looks good for them, but if you dive into the numbers a little bit more, it wasn't a great performance for them. First, in Barton and Winton, which is in Salford, Reform won this seat from Labour, with Michael Phelps getting 676 votes to the Labour Party at 643 votes. And the Greens came third with 363 votes, Conservatives in fourth with 118, Lib Dems at 94, and the Independent at 44. The turnout was pretty low, only 17.82%. Now, this was a pretty big shift from 2025, in which Labour got 62.28%, so they declined almost 30 points. Green went up about 4 points, Conservatives went down by about 8 points, Lib Dems went down by about 4 points, the Independent, new candidate at 2.27%, and then Reform gained almost 35 points. But they only beat the Labour candidate by about 1.7%. So I mean, it's impressive to go from 0 to almost 35%, but they didn't win it by a lot. They won it by, less than, what was it, 33 votes? So it is a good reform win, and Salford is traditionally very labor territory, and Reform getting their first seat on the Salford Council is not, nothing to discuss. Losing 33% of your voters is not the kind of result that, or is the kind of result that makes local parties panic, especially with the local uh, elections this coming May 7th. But like I said, 2/3 of voters still did not choose Reform as their first candidate. So it is good for them, but I wouldn't say the takeaway is that Reform is sweeping everything. The takeaway is more, you know, labor dropping, and the anti-reform vote in this ward was pretty split. So while they can absolutely, win these elections when the vote is split, in more important elections when there's more tactical voting, you probably wouldn't see a reform win here, because if you combine, Labor and Lib Dem, Labor and a fourth of the Green vote, Labor and 2% of the Conservative vote, or the Independent vote, the reform's not winning the seat, and the turnout was down. So we'll see May 7th whether they will hold the seat or not. All right, and then we had the Newquay Porth and Tretheris seat, which is in Cornwall, and this one is pretty interesting as well. Reform held the seat with 30.2% of the vote, which was down from their 2025 result at 37.87%. The Greens came second with 24.8%. They did not stand last time. And the independent candidate had a great showing at 16.9%. The Lib Dems came in fourth at 16.3%, Conservatives at 6.2%, and Labor in last at 5.62%. And again, Reform won, but they only won with around 30% of the vote. That's 70% of people not choosing Reform, and yet they will be represented by Reform. And the Greens coming out of nowhere to finish second is honestly probably more interesting than Reform holding on to the seat. And for the Lib Dems, it's a pretty rough result. Cornwall is the kind of place where they would normally be or want to be the main anti-reform option, and instead they came fourth behind the Greens and an independent. So again, the anti-reform vote was just scattered in so many directions that they were able to squeak out another victory. And this kind of does show the issues of the first past the post system. I personally do like ranked choice voting, but even not ranked choice voting, you have in like Texas and Georgia, you have runoffs. So, if this was in America, you would have Greens and Reform going to a second round, and then there'd only be two candidates. So more people would have preference about who they're voting for in the second round. So this is the issue with first past the post, or just getting the majority of the votes and not having to get over 50%. But when you put these two races together, the pattern is the same one we've been seeing for a few weeks at this point now, which is that Reform is very good at winning when the opposition is fragmented. Reform has a very solid base, and maybe that taps out at around that 30-ish% mark. But when the opposition is so fragmented, it really doesn't matter, because they'll squeak out these wins, but it's not like they're really gaining too much. And again, we have the Greens. They just keep showing up. They had a strong result in Salford, surging to second in Newquay, and continuing to build a case that they can be the home for the anti-establishment voters on the left who don't want to vote for reform. So we're seeing two anti-establishment, more populist parties really dominating in these local elections. And it'll be interesting to see, on the May 7th local elections, how many each party will pick up. I'm assuming the Greens and Reform will do very, very well. So bottom line for these UK by-elections, Reform had pretty good week on paper, but they gained a seat in a Labour seat. They held on in Cornwall, but the vote shares show a bit of weakness and vulnerability. The Greens keep going, and a lot of these races are going to come down to whether the anti-reform vote stays split or whether they might coalesce around a certain candidate, and then Reform has a much lower chance of holding the seat or winning the seat. All right, now Peru. We're going to go back to South America. Not too much of an update this time, but I still want to talk about it because it's, still ongoing. They still don't have final presidential results from the April 12th election. We are now almost 2 weeks past. Keiko Fujimori is still in a strong lead with 70% of the vote. She is already advancing. And the fight for second place is still close between Roberto Sanchez and Rafael Lopez Aliaga, with roughly 95% of the vote counted. Sanchez is ahead by around 24,000 votes. But, there's still 5% of votes, and that could be enough to swing it. Most likely it will be Sanchez moving on to the second round, barring anything extreme. But the final results are not to be confirmed until mid-May, and then the runoff is only 3 weeks after that, June 7th. And like we talked about before, the reason why this was such a mess is not just because the vote count is slow. There were the logistical failures in Lima on election day, where there were missing ballots and delayed materials, which affected tens of thousands of voters. And then recently, the police raided the home of Piero Corvetto, who is the former head of Peru's National Office of Electoral Processes, along with several other locations, as part of an investigation into alleged irregularities. Corvetto had already resigned, saying that he wanted to help restore public trust, but he has denied wrongdoing, and a request to detain him was rejected. And you still have Lopez Aliaga out there, who's been the loudest voice pushing fraud claims. But international observers, including the EU mission, say they found no credible evidence of fraud, and Peru's electoral tribunal rejected calls for a rerun, as well as the National Jury of Elections, who unanimously rejected Lopez Aliaga's request for a new vote, specifically in Lima, which is the home of the right wing in Peru. And like I've said before countless times, there's just so much political instability in Peru, and it really seems that it's not going to stop anytime soon. So you have Keiko Fujimori, who will probably who will be going on to the second round, most likely against Roberto Sanchez, who is left wing. Keiko is right wing. We will have another left versus right. I believe Keiko's lost 3 times in second rounds, so we'll see if she can finally break her curse and finally win. But it'll be tight. I don't think we have any polling yet out of Peru for the second round, just because we don't quite know who is going to be in the second round yet. Once we get some polling result or numbers, I'll definitely start to report on that probably next week or the week after. But yeah, I just wanted to give a quick update because it's just insane in Peru right now. All right, now let's go back to Europe and Denmark, where the election was a month ago and there's still no new government. And might I add, Prime Minister Frederiksen called this snap election herself. She triggered it in February, months before she had to, hoping that her, little standoff with Trump over Greenland would give her party and coalition a boost with voters. But the issue for her is that when the voters went to the polls, the issues that dominated, they weren't Greenland anymore. They were cost of living, pensions, immigration, wealth tax. And the results was that her Social Democratic Party had its worst performance since 1903, with 21.9% and 38 seats, down from 54 years ago. Now Frederiksen is trying to form a government after an electoral gamble that just didn't pay off for her. And the basic problem is that nobody has a clean path. The red bloc, which is the left-leaning bloc in Denmark, did better than the blue bloc, but not well enough to govern alone. So that puts enormous leverage in the hands of Lars Rasmussen. Yeah, Rasmussen, yeah. Oh god, it's so hard to pronounce names sometimes, guys. I'm so sorry. He is the head of the Moderate Party, who hold 14 seats, and they sit right in the middle between the left and the right in Denmark. But the moderates don't want a government that depends too heavily on the far left. The liberals oppose a setup where Frederiksen stays in power while relying on left-wing parties. So she's pretty stuck because the left wants policy concessions, and the center-right doesn't want her to hand any power to the people of the left. So the moderates don't want to rely on the left. Frederiksen doesn't want to rely on the right. It's just, it's a lot. And that really brings up just the fights over policy matter. Things like a wealth tax and limits on pesticide use, which is, we talked about when we previewed or when we recapped this election in my first episode. These are things that really matter. Uh, and they help her with her coalition on the left, but they really make life a lot harder with the center and right wing parties. And some people were saying that she might have to drop the wealth tax, or she might have to give up her ability to be the leader of these coalition talks, and perhaps give it to Lars to see if the moderates can make a coalition. I was reading an article before, and it was saying that Lars was saying he wants to build a coalition. He wants the more moderate members of the Social Democrats, and then he wants the more moderate members of the Danish right wing or right leaning conservative parties. And that seems right now like it might be the most logical because, like I said, the Red coalition, the left in Denmark, cannot make a government themselves. They need moderate support. And right now, Lars is not going to give it to them because he doesn't want the far left to have the power. So it looks like we might have a mixed coalition. Maybe he'll try with the blue bloc, but that seems a little less likely because I don't think they have enough with the more moderate members to form a government. They would need to have the far right, and I don't think Lars wants to do that. So Lars really does hold a lot of power right now in Denmark, and these coalition talks are still ongoing a month after the election. So I will definitely keep you guys updated and see if there's any, news or whether coalition talks will fail or succeed. I'll definitely make sure to keep you guys updated on that. All right, enough with the recaps. Now let's look to next week. In Antigua and Barbuda, where the country is holding a early general election, April 30th. This is a pretty small election because, it's a small parliament. It's 17 elected seats, and the majority is a threshold of just 9, which means, a really small handful of individual constituency results can flip the entire government. So, this is obviously a lot smaller than a major European country where you just have to win a few of these local races, and then you have enough to change government. Prime Minister Gaston Brown and the Antigua and Barbuda Labour Party are trying to win another term. Brown called this snap election nearly 2 years early, framing it as a need for a fresh mandate given, global uncertainty. And, the political logic, makes some sense. The ABLD, which is the Antigua and Barbuda Labour Party, holds a slim majority right now, and Brown is probably just trying to lock in a stronger position before the environment potentially shifts away from his favor again. But the party suffered pretty resounding losses in the 2025 Barbuda Council election, where the Barbuda People's Movement won every seat up for contest. That's a pretty major thing when Barbuda represents its own political or distinct political identity and essentially operates on a different political wavelength from Antigua. Brown may be going to the voters early in part because he thinks it's better now than later, not because he's riding on a wave of success. He's just trying to get ahead of what may be even worse results if he waits another 2 years. The main opposition is the United Progressive Party, led by Jamal Pringle. The UPP came close in 2023 elections, and in the 17-seat parliament, they don't need a massive swing to make this competitive. The UPP in the last election, they won 6 seats, so they only need to flip 3 to get that majority. And if we look at the popular vote, they lost by only less than 2 percentage points. And now you have the OAS, which is the Organization of American States. They are sending in a 17-member observation mission from 11 different countries to help observe the election, make sure there's no irregularities or anything like that. But the bottom line is that the Labour Party, which is the more right party in Antigua and Barbuda, goes in as the incumbent and probably the favorite. Barbuda, it's its own watch point, and this is small enough that individual constituency, that's a hard word, constituency battles matter more than a national polling story. So it comes down to, how the candidates talk to the people. And like I said, they only lost by less than 2 percentage points last time. So it's not going to take much of a swing to get that majority. So we'll see if this snap election by Brown works out in the end or not. We'll see if the voters decide to give him that majority again. I'll definitely have more to update when the election happens. It's happening on, I believe, upcoming Tuesday, right? The 28th. Or the 30th, so that's Thursday. It's next Thursday. But we'll definitely keep you updated with who gets the majority. All right, now we're going to move back over to England. We have the Tembury by-election on April 30th. We have 4 candidates this time around. We have a Conservative, Reform, Liberal Dem, and Green. You know, what makes this one a little bit different from last week is that this isn't a Reform, hold. This is a Conservative hold, so we're going to see if the Conservatives can defend local ground while being, squeezed from the left and the right. And the one thing to note about this award is that they previously used multi-member voting, so you can't really make a direct comparison last time because there was an independent and a conservative candidate that won. So you can't really compare that too much to a traditional one-party seat or one candidate winner seat. But it will be a test to see if Reform is continuing to eat into the Conservatives' vote share. We'll see a battle between the Greens and the Lib Dems about who can capture more of the left-leaning vote. The Greens are trying to really build on that local momentum they've been showing across these by-elections for weeks now. And the Conservatives are still trying to prove that they could hold on to these more rural, small-town seats, even when the national environment is not in their favor. And I think the order of the challengers matter pretty much as the winner does. If Reform finishes a strong second or wins, that really tells a story about where the Tory vote is going. Or rather, if the Lib Dems become the main challenger, or if the Greens overperform again, we'll keep having these same conversations about vote shares and, tactical voting, vote splitting, just the kind of same stories we've been hearing in the UK for the last, 10 or so by-elections in the country. So again, it's a small contest, but it's pretty useful in determining whose voters are showing up and who they might be changing their votes for. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that one, which is happening on the 30th. And then last up, I wanted to mention Texas Senate District 4, where there is a special election next Saturday, May 2nd. I will have a podcast out. I will have a podcast out next Saturday, but the election wouldn't have occurred yet. So this recap will be two elections from now, I believe. 2 episodes from now. But I just wanted to preview it because it'll be interesting to see the swings here. Now, this seat is open because Republican Brandon Creighton left the Texas Senate to become the chancellor of the Texas Tech University system. In this election, we have in this special election, we have Republican Brett Ligon, the former Montgomery County District Attorney, against Democrat Ron Angelini, who is an educator and a small business owner. Now, Ligon goes into this with endorsements from the Lieutenant Governor and from Creighton himself, and this is a pretty, establishment Republican attempt to hold this seat that Trump carried it by 34% of the vote in 2024. And, we had a flip in Senate District 9 earlier this year, and that was a seat that Trump won by only 18 votes, which is still a crazy swing. But even if you applied that swing to the 4th district, you would still have a pretty healthy Republican win of around 5 or so points. But Senate District 4 is a lot more favorable to Republicans than Senate District 9 is. So like I said, the Republican in like 99%, I don't want to, ever make, 100% claims, but 99% the Republican will hold here, and it probably won't be very close. But I think the swing in this district will be interesting. This is right outside of Houston, Houston rural, Houston suburby. But after what happened in Senate District 9, were the Democrat really shocked Republicans by flipping that seat? Although it was in January, so it was a very low turnout. But people are starting to pay attention to these local Texas specials in a way that maybe they wouldn't before. And like I said, the question isn't whether the Democrat will win. The question is the margin. So does Ligon win big and, argue that Senate District 9 was just like a one-off event? Or does Angeletti overperform enough to keep those warning signs still flashing for Republicans nationally? If Democrats are able to hold Ligon below 60%, that would be really meaningful, or even below 55% would be incredible for the Democrats in this seat. So while this is still, very heavily Republican seat, the margin is what really is going to tell this story next week. And we'll be able to really determine, like I say, whether Senate District 9 was just a blip because it was January and there was really low turnout, or whether that was just a sign for what's to come in Texas, and that maybe their new congressional map might have been a dummy mander, but we will get into that after this election to see if it was a fluke or not. All right, guys, so that is going to be it for episode 4. We had the Virginia voters who approved the redistricting referendum. We had Reform UK winning both English Council by-elections this week. We had Peru still stuck in its delay and increasingly chaotic count. We had Denmark, which still does not have a government over a month after its election. We have the Antigua and Barbuda election next week. We have the temporary election. We have the Senate District 4 in Texas. So we have a lot going on. It's a little bit of a slower week nationally. Next week, the week after that, I believe the week after that is the local by-elections in the UK, as well as the Scottish and Welsh parliamentary elections, I believe. And then I believe we have a Australian by-election, which is going to be really interesting because of One Nation. I believe that's what the new right-wing party, basically the Reform equivalent in Australia. So that one's going to be interesting. But next week is a little slow, but then we really pick back up the week after that. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you liked it, please leave a like, subscribe. Trying to get that watch time up. I'm trying to pay off my student loans, people. Please watch my videos. But thank you for watching, if you made it this far. And have a good one.